Imagine waking up one morning to find that everything you worked for, your home, your peace, your future, was suddenly under attack. Not by a stranger, not by some random disaster, but by the very people who were supposed to protect the neighborhood, the HOA. At first, it started with petty fines and ridiculous demands. But soon, it turned into something darker, something no one in the community ever expected. How far would an entitled neighbor go just to get her way? And what happens when her obsession finally backfires? For the Johnson family, moving into Willow Creek felt like the start of a new chapter. Tucked away from the chaos of the city, the neighborhood looked like something out of a postcard. Wide streets lined with perfectly trimmed hedges, kids laughing in driveways, and neighbors chatting over white picket fences. It was a kind of place where you could imagine growing old, where every corner seemed to promise safety and stability. For Michael and Laura Johnson, it was more than just a house. It was a reward for years of sacrifice. Michael had worked double shifts at the hospital. Laura had juggled part-time jobs while raising their two kids. And finally, they could give their children the kind of childhood they had always dreamed of. Their home wasn't the biggest or the flashiest, but was filled with warmth. On weekends, the smell of barbecue drifted from their backyard, mixed with the sound of children's laughter. They thought they had found their forever home. The HOA existed, of course. Every homeowner knew that. At first, it seemed harmless. A monthly newsletter with reminders about lawn care, community garage sales, and the occasional holiday decorating contest. Nothing out of the ordinary. Michael used to joke that the HOA was more of a neighborhood club than a governing body. Sure, there were rules, but they were meant to keep the community looking nice, and the Johnsons didn't mind playing along. After all, who could argue with a clean, well-kept neighborhood? But things began to shift when new faces joined the HOA board. Most people didn't pay much attention to elections. It was usually the same few volunteers running things year after year. This time, however, one woman seemed unusually eager to take control. Her name was Sandra, but everyone whispered about her behind closed doors using another name, the Karen of Willow Creek. From the very beginning, Sandra made her presence known. She showed up at community meetings with a stack of papers, rattling off rule violations and demanding stricter enforcement. She claimed she only wanted to protect property values, but her tone carried an edge that made neighbors uncomfortable. Suddenly, small details that had been overlooked for years were treated like serious offenses. A trash can left out a little too long, a patch of grass not as green as the rest, even the color of a mailbox. At first, the Johnsons didn't think much of it. Laura laughed when they received their first warning letter, a notice about a flower bed that extended 6 inches beyond the HOA's approved guidelines. 6 inches? Seriously? She said, shaking her head. They fixed it, assuming it was just a one-time inconvenience. But it didn't stop there. The warnings kept coming. Their kids' bikes leaning against a garage, a holiday wreath that stayed up a week too long, even the placement of their garden shed. Each time, Sandra was there, either patrolling the streets with a clipboard or snapping photos like she was gathering evidence for a court case. Michael tried to brush it off, telling his wife not to worry. It's just paperwork. She'll get bored eventually. But Sandra didn't get bored. She seemed to thrive on confrontation, feeding off the control she now had over her neighbors' lives. Other families started whispering about their own run-ins with her. One man got fined because his driveway had a small oil stain. Another couple was threatened with legal action over a backyard playset. The tension in Willow Creek was growing, and Sandra was at the center of it all. The Johnsons wanted to keep their heads down, but the pressure kept building. They had moved here for peace, not conflict. Laura began to feel anxious whenever she stepped outside, worried Sandra might be lurking nearby with another complaint. Even their children started noticing. Mom, their youngest, asked one day, "Why does that lady keep staring at our house?" It was a small question, but it carried a heavy weight. This wasn't just about rules anymore. This was about intimidation, about control, about a woman who wanted to bend an entire community to her will. And slowly, the Johnsons realized something chilling. Sandra wasn't going to stop. The flower bed, the shed, the wreath, those were just the opening shots in a much bigger battle. The Johnsons thought they could ignore her, comply with the petty demands, and move on with their lives. But Sandra had other plans. She wanted power. She wanted to dominate. And soon, she would cross a line so outrageous, so unthinkable, that it would shake Willow Creek to its core. Because for Sandra, this wasn't just about rules or property values. This was personal. And the Johnsons were about to find out just how far an entitled neighbor could go when she decided someone else's home was standing in her way. The Johnsons thought the warnings and fines were annoying but survivable. They were wrong. Sandra wasn't just enforcing the rules. She was weaponizing them. It started with letters. Neatly folded envelopes tucked into their mailbox almost every week. Each one filled with citations that sounded absurd. Grass height exceeds community standards by half an inch. Children's toys visible from the street. Exterior paint not approved shade of beige. At first, Michael laughed them off. It's paperwork. Nobody takes this stuff seriously. But then the fines started to stack up. $50 here, $100 there, climbing into the hundreds. The Johnsons were stunned. Their small savings, the money they had set aside for family vacations and school supplies, was being drained by Sandra's endless penalties. And Sandra? She didn't stop at letters. One morning, Laura walked outside and froze. Sandra was standing at the edge of their driveway, snapping photos of their front yard with her phone. No hello, no explanation, just a cold click of a camera capturing every angle. When Laura asked what she was doing, Sandra smiled. Just making sure everything's up to code. It was unsettling. Suddenly, the Johnsons felt like they were living under surveillance. Every time they stepped outside, they wondered, is she watching us right now? Then came the bigger blows. Their mailbox, the one that stood for years without a problem, was suddenly deemed non-compliant. They were ordered to replace it within 14 days or face a $500 fine. The Johnsons pushed back, sending an email asking for clarification. Sandra's response? A curt message stating, non-compliance will result in legal action. It didn't stop there. One evening, Michael returned from work to find a bright orange violation notice taped across their front door like a scarlet letter. This time, the offense was their backyard shed. According to Sandra, its placement was 3 feet too close to the property line. The shed had been there since the day they moved in, approved by the previous HOA board. But Sandra didn't care. Rules are rules, she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. The Johnsons appealed the decision, attending the next HOA meeting in hopes of finding reason. What they walked into felt less like a community discussion and more like a courtroom trial. Sandra sat at the head of the table, flanked by a few loyal board members. As Michael tried to explain their situation, Sandra cut him off. Your property is out of compliance. Period. Her allies nodded silently, rubber-stamping every word. Neighbors watched in uncomfortable silence. A few exchanged sympathetic glances, but no one spoke up. Fear hung in the room. Everyone knew what happened if you crossed Sandra. You became her next target. The Johnsons left the meeting humiliated, but determined. They wouldn't be bullied out of their own home. Michael began researching HOA laws late into the night, while Laura documented every notice, every fine, every confrontation. They thought maybe, just maybe, they could fight back with evidence. But Sandra was always one step ahead. Soon, the harassment turned personal. Their children's bikes were mysteriously moved from the garage to the front yard. And within hours, another violation notice arrived. Their trash cans, placed neatly by the curb, were suddenly reported as blocking the sidewalk. Even their dog became a target. One morning, they received a letter claiming their Labrador, Max, was excessively disruptive, despite neighbors insisting he never barked more than any other dog. It felt less like enforcement and more like sabotage. Then came the breaking point. The Johnsons returned home from a weekend visiting relatives to find a notice pinned to their door, this one stamped in bold red ink. Final warning. Property subject to enforcement action. According to the letter, the HOA had the authority to remedy violations if homeowners failed to comply. That meant Sandra could hire contractors, bill the Johnsons for the work, and, if they didn't pay, place a lien on their home. Laura's hand shook as she read the words. "She's trying to take our house," she whispered. Michael wanted to believe it was an empty threat, but days later, the sound of engines outside shattered that illusion. A crew of workers arrived at their home, trucks idling at the curb. When Michael rushed out to confront them, the foreman simply held up a clipboard. "We were hired by the HOA. We're here to demolish the shed." Michael's blood boiled. "That shed is legal. You can't just..." But before he could finish, Sandra appeared, arms folded, a smug smile plastered across her face. "You've been warned," she said calmly, as if this were nothing more than routine business. The Johnsons tried to stop them, but the workers went ahead. Boards were ripped apart, pieces of the shed tossed onto the lawn like garbage. Years of effort gone in an afternoon. The kids cried watching their playhouse vanish, while Sandra stood there like a queen surveying her victory. The humiliation was unbearable, but the financial blow was worse. Days later, the Johnsons received a bill from the HOA demanding payment for the demolition costs. Over $3,000. If they didn't pay, the HOA threatened they would pursue a lien against the property. That night, Michael sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. "We can't keep living like this," he said. Laura's eyes were red from crying. "She won't stop until she takes everything." They thought about moving, packing up, selling the house, starting over somewhere else. But deep down, they knew that's what Sandra wanted. If they left, she would win. And worse, she would do the same to someone else. So the Johnsons made a decision. They would fight back. Laura began reaching out to other neighbors quietly, asking if they had faced similar treatment. At first, people were hesitant. Nobody wanted to put themselves in Sandra's crosshairs. But slowly, stories emerged. A single mother fined hundreds for her kids' toys in the yard. An elderly couple threatened with foreclosure over peeling paint. A man who had been forced to replace his perfectly good roof because it didn't match community standards. The pattern was clear. Sandra wasn't protecting property values. She was abusing her power, using the HOA as a weapon to control and intimidate. The Johnsons gathered evidence, photographs, testimonies, and even old documents showing the shed had been previously approved. They contacted a lawyer, hoping for a sliver of justice. But Sandra wasn't about to go down quietly. At the next HOA meeting, word spread that the Johnsons were challenging her. The room was packed, neighbors whispering anxiously as Sandra entered with a stack of files. She scanned the crowd, her eyes locking on Michael and Laura with cold fury. The tension was suffocating. This wasn't just another meeting. This was war. Michael stood to speak, heart pounding in his chest. He laid out their evidence, pointing out inconsistencies, showing the unfair treatment. For a moment, the room buzzed with possibility. Maybe, just maybe, the tide was turning. But then Sandra leaned forward, her voice calm but razor sharp. "What the Johnsons failed to mention," she said, "is that non-payment of HOA dues is grounds for foreclosure. And according to our records, they are delinquent." Gasps rippled through the room. Michael's face went pale. He knew it wasn't true. They had the receipts to prove it. But Sandra's words planted a dangerous seed. If people believed her, if the board sided with her, their very home was at risk. The meeting dissolved into chaos, neighbors shouting, others storming out. By the end, nothing was resolved. But the message was clear. Sandra was willing to use every weapon at her disposal, lies, intimidation, even the threat of foreclosure. The Johnsons left shaken, clutching their files, wondering how much longer they could hold on. Because one thing was certain, Sandra wasn't finished, and the battle for Willow Creek was about to reach a breaking point. The Johnsons had endured months of harassment, sabotage, and fear. Fines, violations, threats, and even the demolition of their shed. Sandra had pushed them to the breaking point. But nothing compared to what came next. It happened on a gray, windy morning. Michael was sipping coffee when he saw a folded envelope taped to their front door. His stomach dropped before he even touched it. He already knew who it was from. The words inside made his blood run cold. Notice of foreclosure proceedings. Due to unpaid fines and noncompliance, the HOA hereby initiates action to seize the property at address. Michael's hands trembled. Laura read the notice twice, unable to process the reality. They had paid every single HOA due, every legitimate fee. They had receipts to prove it. But Sandra had manipulated the system, piling on bogus fines until she claimed they owed thousands. And now, she was trying to take their home. That evening, the Johnsons sat at their dining table, documents spread like weapons across the surface. "She's gone too far," Laura whispered. "She can't take our house." Michael's jaw clenched. "She can, unless we stop her." The battle lines were drawn. The Johnsons called their lawyer, who immediately spotted the irregularities. Duplicate fines, backdated violation notices, charges that didn't exist in the HOA bylaws. It was a house of cards Sandra had built on lies. If they took it to court, it would collapse, but they needed proof. So Michael and Laura got to work. They knocked on doors, gathered testimonies, and encouraged neighbors to speak up. At first, people hesitated. Fear still hung over Willow Creek. But when the Johnsons showed them the foreclosure notice, something shifted. "This could happen to any of us," an elderly neighbor muttered. "If she can do this to them, none of us are safe." One by one, voices began to join. Stories poured out of Sandra's intimidation, her threats, her bogus fines. People who had stayed silent out of fear finally realized silence only made her stronger. Armed with evidence and witnesses, the Johnsons prepared for the next HOA meeting, a meeting that felt less like a routine gathering and more like the trial of the century. The room was packed. Folding chairs lined the walls. Neighbors crammed shoulder to shoulder, whispers rippling like electricity. Sandra sat at the head of the table, her usual smug smile replaced with thin-lipped tension. She knew what was coming, but she wasn't going down without a fight. Michael stood first, his voice steady but firm. "We've had enough. My family has been targeted, fined, harassed, and now threatened with foreclosure, all based on false claims. And we're not the only ones." He laid down a thick folder on the table with a heavy thud. Inside were copies of letters, photos, receipts, and testimony from half the neighborhood. Gasps filled the room as neighbors recognized their own stories. Laura stepped forward next, her voice breaking but strong. "We moved here to raise our children in peace. Instead, we've lived in fear, not of crime, not of strangers, but of our own HOA president. Sandra has abused her power, and tonight, we are showing you the proof." The room erupted in murmurs. Some nodded, some whispered in shock, others looked directly at Sandra with narrowed eyes. But Sandra didn't flinch. She leaned back in her chair, her voice sharp as glass. "All of these so-called accusations mean nothing. The Johnsons are delinquent. They're lying to save themselves. The rules are the rules, and they broke them." She pulled out her own folder, thick with papers she claimed were records. But as she flipped through them, Michael caught something. Dates that didn't line up. Fines issued for violations that didn't exist in the bylaws. Duplicate charges for the same offense. "Lies," Michael said, holding up one of her documents. "This fine, unapproved shed placement, 2017. We didn't even move into Willow Creek until 2019. A hush fell over the room. Sandra froze. For the first time, her mask cracked. Neighbors began whispering louder now, eyes darting from the Johnsons to Sandra. Someone in the back shouted, "She fined me for the same thing." Another voice added, "She told me I'd lose my house if I didn't repaint my fence." The tension snapped. People stood, demanding answers, waving their own letters in the air. Sandra tried to shout over them, but the noise swallowed her whole. Finally, Michael raised his voice above the chaos. "We're not just asking you to listen. We're asking you to act. Tonight," he pointed at the other board members, "either you stand with Sandra or you stand with the community she's been terrorizing." The room went silent. All eyes turned to the board. For years, they had been Sandra's puppets, too afraid to cross her. But now, with the entire neighborhood watching, the weight of proof stacked against her, they shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One cleared his throat. I think we need to vote." Sandra's head whipped toward him. "What? You can't." But it was too late. The board called for a vote of no confidence. Hands shot up across the room. board members, residents, neighbors who had suffered quietly for too long. The result was undeniable. Sandra was out. Her face turned crimson, fury boiling beneath her skin. "You'll regret this," she screamed, grabbing her folder and storming toward the door. But her voice was drowned out by the sound of neighbors cheering, clapping, some even crying with relief. For the first time in months, the Johnsons felt like they could breathe. But then, just when it seemed like the nightmare was over, a new twist emerged. The Johnsons' lawyer stood and cleared his throat. "One more thing. Based on the evidence we've gathered, fraudulent fines, unlawful threats of foreclosure, and financial misconduct, we've already filed a motion in court." Gasps filled the room again. "Not only will Sandra be stripped of her position," the lawyer continued, "she will face charges for harassment, abuse of authority, and financial fraud. What she did wasn't just wrong, it was illegal." Sandra froze mid-step. The color drained from her face. For once, she had no words. She stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her, but her exit didn't erase what everyone had just heard. The community had turned against her. The law was closing in, and the Johnsons, once her prime targets, now stood at the center of her downfall. The meeting ended in chaos, laughter, tears, shouts of victory. Neighbors hugged the Johnsons, thanking them for standing up when no one else had the courage. The family who had once felt isolated, beaten down, and powerless had ignited a movement that freed the entire neighborhood. But as Michael and Laura drove home that night, they couldn't shake one question from their minds. Sandra wasn't the type to give up quietly. What would she do next, now that she had lost everything? The answer would shock everyone. The night of the HOA meeting felt like a victory, but the battle wasn't truly over. Sandra was gone from her post, stripped of her power, humiliated in front of her neighbors. Yet the damage she had caused lingered. The Johnsons still face a mountain of bogus fines, a demolished shed, and the shadow of foreclosure paperwork that had nearly stolen their home. But for the first time in months, they weren't fighting alone. The very next morning, neighbors who had once stayed silent began showing up at the Johnsons' doorstep. Some brought copies of their own violation letters. Others brought words of thanks, and a few even brought home-cooked meals, a quiet gesture of gratitude for the family that had finally stood up to the tyrant who had ruled Willow Creek for too long. "Because of you," one elderly neighbor whispered, pressing Laura's hand, "I can finally sleep again." The legal case against Sandra moved quickly. Their lawyer had already filed motions with the court, and when the evidence came spilling out, it painted a damning picture. Sandra hadn't just targeted the Johnsons. She had systematically abused her power, issuing unlawful fines, pocketing money from violation fees, and threatening foreclosure on families who were never actually behind on dues. The courtroom became the stage for her downfall. Witness after witness stepped forward. The single mother fined for her children's toys, the retired veteran harassed over his mailbox, the elderly couple threatened with eviction. Their stories echoed the Johnsons, creating a chorus of voices that revealed a shocking pattern of exploitation. Sandra tried to defend herself, insisting it was all standard HOA procedure. But when the judge held up two of her violation letters side by side, one with a date from before the Johnsons had even moved in, another duplicated and altered, the mask shattered. The ruling was swift. Sandra was found guilty of fraud, harassment, and abuse of authority. She was ordered to pay restitution, not only to the Johnsons, but to every family she had extorted. And when the gavel fell for the final time, the courtroom erupted in quiet, cathartic relief. Sandra left in handcuffs. Not just stripped of her title, but stripped of the power she had wielded so mercilessly. For the Johnsons, the impact was immediate. Their shed was rebuilt, not by order of the HOA, but by the very neighbors who came together on a sunny weekend, hammers and paintbrushes in hand. What had once been a symbol of humiliation was transformed into a monument of solidarity. Michael and Laura's children laughed as they painted the new shed walls bright colors, neighbors cheering them on. For the first time in a long time, Willow Creek felt like a community again. The fines Sandra had imposed were overturned, the foreclosure notices voided, and the Johnsons' record cleared. What once had been a nightmare of paperwork and threats was replaced with a fresh start. But perhaps the greatest impact wasn't legal or financial. It was cultural. The HOA itself underwent a complete transformation. Gone were the days of fear and silence. With Sandra removed, a new board was elected, one made up of ordinary residents who actually cared about the community. Instead of obsessing over grass height or mailbox colors, the focus shifted to real improvements, repairing sidewalks, hosting family events, and creating a neighborhood watch program that made people feel safer, not surveilled. And something else had changed too. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact out of fear of being targeted now waved warmly when passing by. People who had locked themselves behind closed doors began to gather again, hosting barbecues, holiday parties, and casual porch conversations. The walls of fear Sandra had built were replaced by bonds of trust. The Johnsons were no longer just another family in Willow Creek. They had become a symbol of resilience, the ones who refused to back down, who turned the tide not just for themselves, but for everyone. Michael often said it wasn't courage that kept them going. It was necessity. When someone comes after your family, your home, your peace of mind, you either let them take it or you fight. And we chose to fight. Still, the scars were real. Laura admitted there were nights she still jumped at the sound of papers sliding into the mailbox, half expecting another violation notice. The children sometimes whispered about the scary lady with the clipboard. Healing, after all, takes time. But with every passing week, the weight lifted a little more. The most powerful moment came months later, when Laura received a letter, not from Sandra, not from the HOA, but from a neighbor she barely knew. It read, "Thank you. You stood up when the rest of us couldn't. Because of you, I didn't lose my home. Because of you, my kids don't have to grow up in fear. You gave us our community back." Laura wept as she read it, realizing their fight had been about so much more than just one family's home. Sandra's story didn't end in Willow Creek. News of her downfall spread beyond the neighborhood, picked up by local papers, then regional outlets. Headlines painted her as the HOA tyrant who went too far. It sparked conversations across communities about the unchecked power of homeowners associations and how one entitled person could warp an entire system if left unchallenged. In a strange way, Sandra had become infamous, a cautionary tale of what happens when control turns into obsession. For the Johnsons, however, the fame wasn't important. What mattered was peace. They had their home, their dignity, their future, and they had the satisfaction of knowing Sandra could never harm them or anyone else again. Looking back, Michael often told the story not as one of victimhood, but of awakening. We thought the HOA was there to protect us. What we learned is that power without accountability can be dangerous, whether in government, business, or even a small neighborhood association. It only takes one person to turn rules into weapons. Laura added, but also only takes one family to stand up and say, enough. And when you do, you'd be surprised how many others will stand with you. The story of Willow Creek became more than just neighborhood drama. It became a reminder that fairness, justice, and community are worth fighting for, even when the battle feels impossible. In the end, the Johnsons didn't just save their home. They saved their neighborhood. And as viewers, we're left with a haunting but important question. Backhand index pointing right how many Sandras are out there right now? And what would you do if one came after your home?